Hello there and welcome. I'm glad you found your way here tonight. Maybe you've had a long day, or maybe you're the kind of person who likes falling asleep to quiet thoughts and gentle stories rather than counting sheep. Either way, this journey is for you. You've got nothing to do but rest. Let your mind relax, your breathing slow, and your body grow light. Because tonight, we're going to explore something deeply personal, something intimate and revealing. We're going to wander through the lore of Blackwater Massacre. The Blackwater Massacre stands as the defining moment that sets Red Dead Redemption 2 in motion. A catastrophic failure that transforms the Van der Linde gang from confident outlaws into desperate fugitives. When the game begins in the frozen mountains of Coulter, the gang is already broken, already running, or already haunted by what happened in that prosperous port town. The massacre is never shown, never played, never fully explained, yet it looms over every moment of the story like a ghost that refuses to be laid to rest. This narrative choice, to start the game after the disaster, to keep the massacre off screen, to reveal it only through fragments and contradictions, is one of the most brilliant decisions in Red Dead Redemption 2. By making Blackwater invisible, the game makes it mythic. The massacre exists in the space between what different characters say about it, in the gaps and silences, in the things they refuse to talk about. It becomes whatever the player imagines, whatever best explains the broken, desperate people we meet in the game's opening. This absence is more powerful than any cutscene could be. Trauma lives in the gaps, in the things people cannot bring themselves to say, in the memories they try to suppress but cannot escape. The decision to start after Blackwater also serves a thematic purpose. Red Dead Redemption 2 is not a story about how the gang became successful outlaws. It is a story about how they fell apart, how their dream died, how loyalty and love were not enough to save them from the consequences of their choices. Starting after Blackwater means starting after the point of no return, after the moment when their fate was sealed. Everything that happens in the game is aftermath, is falling action, is the slow collapse that Blackwater set in motion. The events took place in May 1899 in the bustling town of Blackwater on the shores of Flatiron Lake. Blackwater was a symbol of progress and civilization, a place where the Old West was giving way to the new America. The streets were paved, the buildings were modern, the law was organised and well funded. It represented everything Dutch van der Linde claimed to despise, a monument to the encroaching civilization that was destroying the freedom he cherished. The target was a ferry docked at Blackwater, carrying a fortune in bank money, $150,000, an astronomical sum in 1899. To put this in perspective, that amount would be worth approximately $4.5 million in today's currency. It was the kind of score that could set the gang up for life, the kind of money that could fund Dutch's dream of escaping to somewhere far away where they could live free from the law. It was also the kind of score that was far too good to be true. The gang members who participated in the Blackwater ferry robbery included Dutch van der Linde, Micah Bell, John Marston, Bill Williamson, Javier Escuela, Davy Callender, Matt Callender, Jenny Kirk, and Sean Maguire. These were some of the gang's best fighters, their most trusted members. Crucially, Arthur Morgan and Hosea Matthews, the two most experienced and level-headed members of the gang, were not present. Arthur was handling other business, and Hosea was with him. Arthur and Hosea were Dutch's conscience, the voices of reason that tempered his more reckless impulses. without them there to question the plan, to point out the obvious dangers, to talk Dutch down from a job that was clearly too risky, the gang walked into disaster. From the moment the gang made their move, everything went wrong. The Blackwater Police Department responded immediately, far faster than anyone expected. But it was not just the local police. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was there as well, heavily armed and ready for a fight. This was not a coincidence. This was not bad luck. The Pinkertons were waiting, or at the very least they were close enough to respond with overwhelming force. The gang found themselves trapped on the ferry, surrounded by lawmen, caught in a killing field with no easy way out. The firefight that erupted was brutal and chaotic. Guns blazed from all sides. The ferry became a slaughterhouse. According to official reports, 37 combatants died in the Blackwater Massacre, 22 outlaws and 15 law enforcement officers. The number of civilian casualties was never specified. But we know there were innocent people caught in the crossfire, people who had nothing to do with the robbery, people who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. There are also rumours, never confirmed but persistent throughout the game, that the legendary gunslinger Landon Ricketts was somehow involved in the Blackwater Massacre. Ricketts was one of the most famous gunfighters of the Old West, a man whose reputation was built on surviving impossible odds. In Red Dead Redemption, the first game, Ricketts tells John Marston that he left the United States for Mexico after the Blackwater Massacre of 1899. The timing is too perfect to be a coincidence. Was Ricketts in Blackwater when the robbery went down? Was he one of the people shooting at the gang? The game never answers these questions, but the implication is clear. Landon Ricketts was there, and his presence made an already disastrous situation even worse. The plan was pushed heavily by Micah Bell, who had joined the gang only months before the Blackwater job. Micah was a newcomer, an outsider who had not earned the trust and loyalty that bound the core members of the gang together. Yet somehow he had Dutch's ear. Somehow he convinced Dutch that this ferry robbery was worth the risk, that the reward justified the danger of hitting a target in such a heavily policed town. Looking back, knowing what we know about Micah's eventual betrayal, his role in pushing for the Blackwater job takes on a sinister significance. The question of when Micah started working with the Pinkertons is never definitively answered in the game, but the evidence is damning. At Micah's camp near Strawberry, which he used before joining the gang, there is a wanted poster for Dutch van der Linde offering a reward of $1,000. Why would Micah have a wanted poster for Dutch unless he was planning to turn him in? Why would he join the gang if not to get close to Dutch and set him up for capture? The Blackwater job was the perfect opportunity, a high-profile robbery in a heavily policed town, with the Pinkertons conveniently close enough to respond immediately. Agent Milton tells Arthur late in the game that Micah became an informant after they returned from Guarma, which would mean Micah was not responsible for the Blackwater trap. But Milton could be lying, could be protecting his source, could be trying to sow discord in the gang. The wanted poster at Micah's old camp suggests Micah was planning to betray Dutch from the beginning, which would make Blackwater part of a long-term plan to destroy the gang from within. Whether Micah was a rat before Blackwater, or became one afterward, the massacre gave him exactly what he needed. A broken, desperate gang that could be manipulated and eventually destroyed. But there was no time to process what had happened, no time to question or confront anyone about anything. The gang was fighting for their lives, trying to shoot their way out of an ambush that was closing in from all sides. And then, in the chaos, Dutch van der Linde shot an innocent woman in the head. Her name was Heidi McCourt. She was on the ferry, a defenceless civilian who posed no threat to anyone. This was not self-defense. This was not an accident. This was Dutch van der Linde, the man who preached about protecting the weak and fighting for those who could not fight for themselves, murdering an innocent woman in cold blood. The gang members who witnessed it were horrified. Karen Jones later tells Arthur that Dutch shot a girl in Blackwater, her voice filled with disbelief and disgust. Jenny Kirk, before she died from her wounds, reportedly said that Dutch went crazy during the robbery. These accounts suggest that Dutch's murder of Heidi McCourt was not a calculated decision, but a moment of panic, a loss of control, a glimpse of the violence and selfishness that lurks beneath Dutch's philosophical exterior. The game never shows us Heidi McCourt. We never see her face, never hear her voice, never learn anything about her life beyond the fact that she died on that ferry. This absence is deliberate. Heidi McCourt is not a character, but a symbol, a representation of all the innocent people the gang has hurt, all the lives they have destroyed in pursuit of their own freedom. Her invisibility in the narrative mirrors her invisibility to Dutch in that moment. She was not a person to him, just an obstacle, just collateral damage in his escape. Heidi McCourt's death is the moral event horizon for Dutch van der Linde, the moment when he crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. The aftermath of Heidi McCourt's death is never addressed by Dutch. He never apologizes, never expresses remorse, never acknowledges that he did something wrong. Instead, he buries the memory, refuses to talk about Blackwater, becomes angry when people bring it up. And this refusal to confront what he did is part of Dutch's psychological unravelling throughout the game. He cannot admit that he made a mistake, cannot face the reality of what he has become, cannot reconcile his self-image as a righteous outlaw with the fact that he murdered a defenceless woman. The question that haunts the game is whether Blackwater changed Dutch, or simply revealed who he always was. Did the stress and violence of the massacre break something in Dutch's mind, or did it strip away the mask he'd been wearing, exposing the selfish, violent man underneath? Arthur struggles with this question throughout the game, trying to reconcile his memories of the Dutch who saved him as a child with the Dutch who murders, manipulates and betrays. Hosea, who knew Dutch longer than anyone, suggests a different interpretation. In conversations with Arthur, Hosea implies that Dutch has always had a dark side, a capacity for violence and cruelty that he kept hidden beneath his charm and his philosophy. Hosea suggests that he and Arthur were the ones who kept Dutch's worst impulses in check, who provided the moral compass that Dutch lacked. Blackwater was not the cause of Dutch's fall. It was the beginning of a process that was always going to happen once the right circumstances aligned. In the chaos of the firefight, gang members started falling. Davy Calander was shot, mortally wounded. His brother Matt Calander was also hit, though his fate would not be known until later. Jenny Kirk, one of the few women in the gang who actively participated in jobs, was shot and wounded. Sean McGuire was captured by the law, dragged away as the gang fought to escape. John Marston was shot and badly injured, though he managed to stay with the group as they fled. The gang had to abandon the money. $150,000, the fortune they had risked everything for, had to be left behind. Dutch and Hosea, who arrived after the shooting started, managed to hide the money somewhere in or near Blackwater, but there was no time to retrieve it. The law was everywhere, the Pinkertons were hunting them, and the gang had to run or die. They fled north, into the mountains, into the worst blizzard in years, leaving behind the money, leaving behind their dead, leaving behind any hope of the easy life that SCORE was supposed to provide. The journey north was a nightmare. Davy Callender clung to life, but his wounds were too severe. He died shortly after the gang reached the abandoned mining town of Coulter, buried in the snow far from home. Davy's death is slow and painful, and there is nothing anyone can do to save him. He dies surrounded by his gang family, but his death is meaningless. A waste of a life for a SCORE that failed. Matt Callender's fate was even worse. He was captured by the Pinkertons, and according to later dialogue, he was tortured for information before being killed. The Pinkertons wanted to know where the gang was headed, wanted to know who else was involved, wanted to break Mac and use him to destroy the gang. Whether Mac talked before he died is never confirmed, but the fact that the Pinkertons were able to track the gang so effectively throughout the game suggests that they got something from him. The loss of both Callender brothers is a tragedy that affects everyone in the gang, a reminder that this life they are living is not romantic or glorious, but brutal and deadly. Jenny Kirk also succumbed to her injuries, dying before the gang even made it to Coulter. Her body had to be left behind, buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the mountains. Jenny was tough, capable, respected by the other gang members. She was also loved by Lenny Summers, who was devastated by her death. Lenny carries the grief of Jenny's death throughout the game, and it affects his relationship with Dutch. Lenny is one of the first gang members to openly question Dutch's leadership, to suggest that maybe Dutch is leading them to destruction. Jenny's death is part of what opens Lenny's eyes to the reality of their situation. Gee, Lenny also lost his father's pocket watch during the Blackwater chaos, one of the few things he had to remember his father by. Losing it during Blackwater is symbolic of everything the gang lost that day. Not just money or members, but pieces of themselves. Connections to their pasts, reminders of who they used to be. Sean Maguire's capture during Blackwater and his subsequent rescue in Chapter 2 provides one of the few moments of triumph in the game's early hours. When Arthur, Charles, Javier and Trelawney successfully break Sean out of the bounty hunter's custody, it feels like a victory. But Sean's rescue is also a reminder of how much they lost at Blackwater. Sean himself is changed by his time in captivity. He puts on a brave face, jokes and laughs, but there are moments when the mask slips, when you can see the fear underneath. Sean knows how close he came to being hanged or shot. This knowledge makes him more reckless, more determined to prove that he is not afraid, and it drives him to take risks that eventually get him killed in Rhodes. John Marston was shot during the massacre, badly wounded but not killed. He carries the physical scars of Blackwater on his body, but the psychological scars run deeper. John saw Dutch kill Heidi McCourt. He saw the gang's carefully planned robbery turn into chaos. He saw friends die and barely escaped with his own life. These experiences plant seeds of doubt about Dutch that grow throughout Red Dead Redemption 2, until John finally chooses to leave the gang and save his family rather than follow Dutch to certain death. The Blackwater Massacre destroyed the Van der Linde gang's sense of invincibility. Before Blackwater, they were successful outlaws who'd been operating for years, pulling off jobs, evading the law, living by their own rules. After Blackwater, they were hunted criminals with prices on their heads, forced to flee from state to state, always one step ahead of the Pinkertons, always looking over their shoulders. The gang lost 3 members in Blackwater, Davy, Mac and Jenny, and lost Sean to capture. They lost the money they had risked everything for. They lost their reputation. Most importantly, they lost their confidence in Dutch. The psychological trauma of Blackwater manifests differently in each gang member who survived it. Bill Williamson, who was present at the massacre, becomes increasingly paranoid and aggressive after Blackwater. Bill was never the smartest or most capable member of the gang, no, but he was loyal and he followed orders. Blackwater shattered his simple worldview. He saw Dutch kill an innocent woman. He saw the Pinkertons waiting for them as if they knew the gang was coming. He saw friends die. Bill deals with this trauma by becoming more violent, more suspicious, more desperate to prove his worth to Dutch. He lashes out at anyone who questions Dutch's leadership, because questioning Dutch means confronting the possibility that Blackwater was Dutch's fault, and Bill cannot handle that truth. Bill's loyalty to Dutch after Blackwater is not really loyalty, it is denial. As long as Bill follows Dutch, as long as he believes in Dutch's plan, he does not have to face the reality that he participated in a massacre, that he helped kill innocent people. When the gang finally falls apart, Bill cannot accept it. He forms his own gang and continues the outlaw life, becoming more brutal and more desperate until John Marston hunts him down in Red Dead Redemption. Javier Escuella's response to Blackwater is more complex. Javier idolized Dutch, saw him as a savior who rescued him from certain death in Mexico, and gave him a family, a purpose, a cause worth fighting for. Blackwater challenges this idealization. Javier was there. He saw what Dutch did. But Javier cannot bring himself to question Dutch, because doing so would mean questioning everything he has built his life around. So Javier chooses loyalty over truth, chooses to believe in Dutch even when the evidence of Dutch's madness becomes overwhelming. This choice costs Javier his friendship with Arthur and John, costs him his place in the gang when it finally splits, and eventually costs him his freedom when John captures him in Red Dead Redemption. Javier's tragedy is that he is loyal to an idea of Dutch that no longer exists, if it ever did. Karen Jones is one of the gang members most affected by what she heard about Blackwater. She was not there for the robbery itself, but she heard the stories afterward, heard about Dutch killing that girl, heard about the chaos and the bloodshed. Karen deals with this knowledge by drinking, by trying to drown out the horror of what her gang has become. Throughout the game, Karen's drinking gets progressively worse, her behaviour more erratic, her despair more obvious. She knows the gang is doomed, knows that Dutch is leading them all to destruction, but she does not know how to leave. By the epilogue, Karen has disappeared entirely, and the implication is that she drank herself to death, another victim of Blackwater's long shadow. The gang members who were not at Blackwater, Arthur, Hosea, Charles, Sadie and others, have to piece together what happened from fragments of information, from things people say and things they refuse to say. This incomplete knowledge creates suspicion and mistrust. Arthur knows something terrible happened at Blackwater, knows that Dutch killed an innocent woman, but he does not know the full story. This uncertainty makes it harder for Arthur to confront Dutch, harder for him to know when Dutch has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Arthur Morgan was not at Blackwater, and this fact haunts him throughout the game. He was not there to stop Dutch from making a terrible decision. He was not there to protect the gang members who died. He was not there to see what Dutch did to Heidi McCourt. Arthur has to piece together what happened from the accounts of others, and what he learns troubles him deeply. In his journal, Arthur writes about Blackwater with a mixture of confusion and concern, trying to understand how everything went so wrong. Arthur's entire arc in Red Dead Redemption 2 is about trying to save what can be saved from the wreckage of Blackwater, trying to get people out before the gang collapses completely. Hosea Matthews shares Arthur's concerns. Hosea was Dutch's oldest friend, the man who had been with him since the beginning, and even he is disturbed by what happened in Blackwater. Hosea knows that Dutch has changed, that something broke in him during that robbery. Throughout the game, Hosea tries to steer Dutch away from Micah's influence, tries to convince him to abandon the outlaw life and settle down somewhere safe. But Dutch will not listen. The relationship between Arthur and Hosea becomes more important after Blackwater. With Dutch increasingly unreliable, Arthur and Hosea become the gang's real leaders, the ones making practical decisions, the ones trying to keep people alive. Charles Smith, a relative newcomer to the gang, lacks the full context of Blackwater. Charles joined the gang shortly before the massacre, and while he was not present for the robbery itself, he has witnessed its aftermath. Charles is one of the most level-headed and moral members of the gang, and he is deeply troubled by what he's learned about Blackwater. In conversations with Arthur, Charles expresses concern about Dutch's leadership and the direction the gang is heading. Charles is pragmatic enough to recognise that the gang cannot survive much longer, and he begins making plans to leave before it's too late. His eventual departure is one of the few success stories to emerge from the Blackwater disaster. Charles gets out, survives, and builds a new life for himself. Sadie Adler, who joins the gang after Blackwater, never fully understands why the gang is so broken when she meets them. She sees them as strong, capable outlaws who saved her from the O'Driscolls. She does not realise that the gang she joined is a shadow of what it once was, that Blackwater destroyed something fundamental in their unity and purpose. As Sadie becomes more involved in the gang's activities, she starts to see the cracks, starts to understand that these people are not just running from the law, they're running from themselves, from what they did and what they have become. The Blackwater money becomes a symbol of everything wrong with Dutch's leadership after the massacre. Dutch talks constantly about getting back to Blackwater, about retrieving the money, about how that fortune will solve all their problems. We just need more money becomes his mantra, his excuse for every risky job, every questionable decision. But the money is not the solution, it is the problem. The money represents Dutch's inability to let go of the past, his refusal to accept that Blackwater was a disaster, his desperate need to believe that he can still win. The gang cannot return to Blackwater for most of the game. The town is crawling with Pinkertons and lawmen who are specifically looking for members of the Van der Linde gang. The obsession with the Blackwater money reveals Dutch's fundamental flaw. His inability to accept failure, to admit mistakes, to change course when a plan is not working. Dutch would rather lead the gang to destruction than admit that he was wrong about Blackwater, wrong to trust Micah, wrong to kill Heidi McCourt. This stubbornness, this pride, this refusal to face reality is what ultimately destroys the gang. Micah also provides Dutch with something he desperately needs after Blackwater: validation. Micah tells Dutch what he wants to hear, that he is a genius, that his plans are brilliant, that anyone who questions him is a traitor. After Blackwater, when Dutch's confidence is shaken, when he is haunted by what he did to Heidi McCourt, Micah's constant praise and support become addictive. Micah also provides Dutch with an excuse for Blackwater's failure. If Micah was working with the Pinkertons, if the job was a trap, then Dutch is not responsible for what happened. He was betrayed, not incompetent. This narrative allows Dutch to avoid confronting the truth, that he made a bad decision, that he killed an innocent woman, that his leadership got people killed. The Blackwater Massacre also attracted the attention of some of the most dangerous lawmen in the country. Agent Milton and Agent Ross of the Pinkerton Detective Agency made it their personal mission to destroy the Van der Linde gang. The Pinkertons were not local sheriffs who could be bribed or evaded. They were professional manhunters with resources, intelligence networks, and the backing of the federal government. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was a real organisation, founded in 1850 by Alan Pinkerton. By the 1890s, the Pinkertons were one of the most powerful private law enforcement agencies in the United States. They had resources that local sheriffs could not match, national networks of informants, access to telegraph communications, the ability to pursue criminals across state lines. For outlaws like the Van der Linde gang, the Pinkertons represented an existential threat. The historical context of the Blackwater Massacre is important for understanding its significance. The year 1899 was a turning point in American history, the end of one century and the beginning of another. The frontier was officially closed, declared settled by the US Census Bureau in 1890. The Wild West, the era of cowboys and outlaws and gunfighters, was ending. The modern age, with its technology and bureaucracy and organised law enforcement, was beginning. The Blackwater Massacre represents this transition. It is an old-fashioned robbery, the kind of job that might have worked 20 years earlier, attempted in a modern town with modern law enforcement. The gang is using tactics from the past in a world that has moved on, and they are destroyed because of it. Blackwater set in motion a cycle of violence and desperation that the gang could never escape. They needed money to run, so they pulled more jobs. The jobs attracted more attention from the law, which forced them to run again. Running required more money, which meant more jobs, which meant more attention. Each robbery, each confrontation, each desperate act brought them closer to destruction. Blackwater set this cycle in motion, and nothing the gang did afterward could break it. Hosea's death during the St. Denis bank robbery is a direct consequence of Blackwater. The St. Denis job is another desperate attempt to get enough money to escape, another job that Dutch insists will solve all their problems. But like Blackwater, the St. Denis job is a trap. The Pinkertons are waiting, and the gang walks right into an ambush. Hosea is shot and killed by Agent Milton, dying in the street while Dutch watches. Hosea's death removes the last voice of reason in Dutch's inner circle, leaving him alone with Micah's poison. After Hosea dies, Dutch's descent into madness accelerates, and the gang's destruction becomes inevitable. The Guarma chapter, which follows immediately after the St. Denis disaster, or is what happens when Dutch is completely cut off from the people who might restrain him. On Guarma, Dutch kills an old woman in cold blood, just as he killed Heidi McCourt in Blackwater. The parallel is clear. Dutch has not changed, has not learned, has not grown. He is the same man who murdered an innocent woman on that ferry. Arthur's reaction to Dutch killing the old woman on Guarma is telling. He is horrified, but he is not surprised. By this point in the story, Arthur has accepted that Dutch is capable of terrible things. Guarma is the moment when Arthur stops making excuses for Dutch, stops trying to rationalize his behavior, stops believing that Dutch will eventually come to his senses. Arthur's death is the final price of Blackwater. If the gang had never gone to Blackwater, If Dutch had listened to Hosea and Arthur and called off the job, Arthur might have lived longer. Blackwater set the gang on a path of constant running, constant stress, constant exposure to danger and disease. Arthur's tuberculosis is a physical manifestation of the gang's decay, a disease that slowly destroys him just as Blackwater slowly destroyed the gang. Arthur's final act is to buy John time to escape, to hold off the Pinkertons long enough for John to get away with his family. Arthur dies on a mountain, alone, having given everything to save people who might not have saved him. The epilogue of Red Dead Redemption 2, which follows John Marston after Arthur's death, shows the long-term consequences of Blackwater. John tries to build a new life, tries to be a better man, tries to leave his outlaw past behind. But the past will not let him go. He is still wanted for Blackwater, still has a price on his head. When John finally confronts Micah on Mount Harken, he discovers a chest in Micah's camp containing the Blackwater money, or at least a significant portion of it. John's share comes to $20,000, enough to buy land and start a new life with his family. The revelation that Micah had the money all along recontextualizes everything. If Micah had the money, that means Dutch gave it to him, or at least told him where it was hidden. This suggests a level of trust between Dutch and Micah that excluded everyone else in the gang, including Arthur and Hosea. When Dutch shoots Micah at the end of the game, it might be an act of justice, a final acknowledgement that Micah destroyed the gang. Or it might be Dutch eliminating the one person who knew the truth about Blackwater. Dutch leaves the money for John, a gesture that might be interpreted as redemption or simply as exhaustion. Dutch has nothing left. The gang is gone. His dream is dead. John uses the money to buy Beecher's Hope, the ranch where he and his family finally settle down. For a few years, John gets to live the dream that Dutch always promised but never delivered. A place of his own, freedom from the law, a chance to be something other than an outlaw. But even this happiness is temporary. In Red Dead Redemption, the first game, the Pinkertons come for John at Beecher's Hope. They force him to hunt down his former gang members to betray the people he once called family. When John has fulfilled his usefulness, the Pinkertons come to Beecher's Hope with an army. They gun John down in front of his barn, in front of his family, ending his life in the same place he tried to build a new one. John's death is the final consequence of Blackwater. The massacre set in motion a chain of events that led inevitably to John's execution. Dutch's final appearance in Red Dead Redemption 2, when he shoots Micah and walks away without taking the money, is his acknowledgement of Blackwater's true cost. Dutch finally understands that the money was never the point, that chasing it destroyed everything he claimed to care about. He walks away into the mountains, a broken man who will spend the next 12 years running from the law before finally dying in 1911, cornered by John Marston and the Pinkertons. The Blackwater Massacre is the ghost that haunts Red Dead Redemption 2, then the unseen event that shapes everything that happens in the game. It is a story about ambition and its costs, about loyalty and its limits, about violence and its consequences. It is a story about people who made terrible choices and paid terrible prices, about a dream that was always a lie, about an era that was always going to end. The massacre is never shown, never played, never fully explained, and this absence makes it more powerful than any cutscene could be. It is a wound that never heals, a sin that cannot be forgiven, a mistake that cannot be undone. It is the beginning of the end. the first domino in a chain that leads inevitably to death and destruction. And it is the reason why, when Red Dead Redemption 2 finally ends, when the last gang member has died or disappeared, when the Old West has finally been tamed, we understand that it all started on a ferry in Blackwater, with a robbery that went wrong, and a woman who died for no reason, and nothing was ever the same again. The legacy of Blackwater extends beyond the immediate destruction of the Linde gang to influence the entire narrative arc of both Red Dead Redemption games. In the first game, set in 1911, 12 years after the massacre, Blackwater is still remembered as one of the most notorious incidents in the history of the American West. The massacre is mentioned in newspapers, discussed by NPCs, referenced by lawmen as justification for their pursuit of former gang members. It has become part of the mythology of the dying West, a symbol of the lawlessness that the modern age has supposedly eliminated. For John Marston in Red Dead Redemption, Blackwater is the crime that the law never forgot, the atrocity that justified the Pinkertons' relentless pursuit of everyone involved. When Agent Ross forces John to hunt down his former gang members, he uses Blackwater as leverage, reminding John that he is wanted for his role in the massacre, that he can never truly escape his past. The massacre is the chain that binds John to his outlaw life, the sin that he can never atone for, the reason why the law will never let him go. Agent Edgar Ross, who appears in both games, is particularly obsessed with the Blackwater Massacre. In Red Dead Redemption 2, Ross is a younger agent working under Agent Milton. He is present during several confrontations with the gang, always watching, always gathering information. By the time of Red Dead Redemption, Ross has risen to a position of power within the Bureau of Investigation, and he uses that power to force John Marston to betray his former friends. Ross sees the Blackwater Massacre as the symbol of everything wrong with the Old West: lawless violence, disregard for innocent life, criminals who thought they were above the law. Destroying everyone involved in Blackwater becomes Ross's mission, his obsession, his legacy. The game explores how historical events are remembered and mythologized, how the truth becomes distorted over time, how different people remember the same event in different ways. For the law, Blackwater is a story of brave officers defending innocent civilians from ruthless outlaws. For the survivors of the Linde gang, it is a story of betrayal and tragedy, of a job that went wrong and destroyed everything they had. For the people of Blackwater, it is a story that has faded into the background, just another violent incident in a violent time, barely remembered by those who are not directly affected. This multiplicity of perspectives is central to Red Dead Redemption 2's approach to storytelling. The game does not present a single, authoritative version of what happened at Blackwater. Instead, it offers fragments, contradictions, different accounts from different people with different agendas. This approach mirrors how historical events are actually remembered, not as clear, objective facts, but as contested narratives shaped by the perspectives and biases of those who tell them. The game also explores how trauma is passed down through generations, how the sins of the fathers are visited upon the sons. Jack Marston, John's son, grows up in the shadow of Blackwater and the Linde gang's crimes. He loses his father because of decisions made before he was born, because of a robbery that went wrong in 1899. In the epilogue of Red Dead Redemption, after John's death, Jack tracks down Edgar Ross and kills him, perpetuating the cycle of violence that Blackwater initiated. Jack becomes an outlaw, just like his father, just like the gang members who raised him, because he cannot escape the legacy of Blackwater. This generational trauma is one of the most tragic aspects of the Blackwater story. The massacre does not just destroy the people who are there, it destroys their children, their families, everyone connected to them. Abigail Marston loses her husband because of Blackwater. Jack Marston loses his father and his innocence because of Blackwater. The ripples of that one terrible day in May 1899 spread outward, touching lives that had nothing to do with the original crime, destroying futures that had not yet been born. The game uses Blackwater to explore questions of justice and revenge, of whether violence can ever truly be justified, of whether the cycle of retribution can ever be broken. The Pinkertons claim to represent justice, but their methods are often indistinguishable from the outlaws they hunt. They torture, they kill, they manipulate and blackmail. They use John Marston as a weapon, and then kill him when he has served his purpose. Is this justice? Or is it just another form of violence, another link in the chain that Blackwater forged? The game does not provide easy answers to these questions. It presents situations and allows players to draw their own conclusions. But it suggests that the cycle of violence can only be broken by choosing not to participate in it, by walking away even when walking away seems impossible. The characters who survive: Charles Smith, Sadie Adler, Tilly Jackson, Mary Beth Gaskill, are the ones who manage to leave the outlaw life behind, who build new lives away from the violence and the killing. But even they carry the scars of what they experienced, the memories of what they lost. The Blackwater Massacre also serves as a commentary on the nature of the American frontier and the mythology that surrounds it. The frontier is often romanticized as a place of freedom and opportunity, where individuals could carve out their own destinies free from the constraints of civilization. But Red Dead Redemption 2 presents a more complex and darker vision of the frontier. It was a place of violence and exploitation, where freedom for some meant oppression for others, where the strong preyed on the weak, where justice was often just another word for revenge. Dutch van der Linde embodies this contradiction. He talks about freedom and fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves, but his actions reveal the hollowness of these ideals. He kills innocent people, exploits his followers' loyalty, prioritizes his own survival over the welfare of his gang. Dutch's philosophy is revealed as self-serving rhetoric, a justification for violence and theft rather than a genuine commitment to justice or freedom. Blackwater is the moment when this truth becomes undeniable, when Dutch's actions contradict his words so completely that even his most loyal followers begin to doubt him. The game suggests that the mythology of the frontier, the idea of the noble outlaw fighting against an unjust system, is largely a lie, a story that people tell themselves to justify violence and lawlessness. The Van der Linde gang are not Robin Hood figures stealing from the rich to give to the poor. They're criminals who kill and steal for their own benefit, who hurt innocent people, who leave destruction in their wake. Blackwater strips away the romantic veneer and reveals the ugly reality underneath. Yet the game also shows that the people in the gang are not simply villains. They are complex individuals with their own motivations, their own struggles, their own capacity for kindness and cruelty. Arthur Morgan is a killer and a thief, but he is also capable of great compassion and self-sacrifice. John Marston is a criminal, but he is also a devoted father trying to protect his family. The game refuses to reduce its characters to simple moral categories, instead presenting them as flawed human beings trying to survive in a harsh and unforgiving world. This moral complexity is what makes the Blackwater Massacre so powerful as a narrative device. It is not a simple story of good versus evil, of heroes versus villains. It is a story of people making terrible choices for understandable reasons, of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and their destruction. It is a story that resists easy moral judgments, that forces players to grapple with difficult questions about justice, violence, and the cost of survival. The massacre also highlights the role of chance and circumstance in shaping people's lives. If Arthur and Hosea had been at Blackwater, the job might have gone differently. If the Pinkertons had not been there, the gang might have escaped with the money. If Dutch had not panicked and killed Heidi McCourt, the gang might have maintained their unity. But these things did not happen. The circumstances aligned in the worst possible way, and the result was disaster. The game suggests that life is shaped as much by chance as by choice. That sometimes people are destroyed not because they are evil, but because they are unlucky. Yet the game also suggests that people have agency, that their choices matter, that they can shape their own destinies even in a world governed by chance. Arthur chooses to help John escape, to save as many people as he can before he dies. John chooses to leave the gang and build a new life for his family. Charles chooses to walk away from violence and find peace. These choices do not guarantee happy endings. John is still killed, Arthur still dies, but they matter. They represent the characters' refusal to be passive victims of circumstance, their determination to create meaning and purpose in a world that offers neither. The Blackwater Massacre embodies this tension between fate and free will. Was the massacre inevitable, or could it have been prevented? Were the gang members doomed from the moment they joined Dutch, or did they have opportunities to escape that they failed to take? The game does not provide definitive answers, but it suggests that both fate and choice play roles in shaping people's lives. The gang members made choices that led them to Blackwater, but they also faced circumstances beyond their control. They were both agents of their own destruction and victims of forces larger than themselves. The emotional resonance of Blackwater comes from this complexity, from the recognition that the massacre was both preventable and inevitable, that the gang members were both responsible for their fate and victims of it. This complexity makes the tragedy more powerful, more real, more human. It is easy to dismiss fictional characters as simply good or evil, to judge them from a distance. But Red Dead Redemption 2 forces players to see the gang members as people, to understand their motivations, to feel their pain. And once you see them as people, their destruction becomes genuinely tragic. The game's use of Blackwater as an off-screen event is crucial to achieving this emotional impact. By keeping the massacre invisible, the game makes it more personal, more intimate. Players do not see the violence, they see its aftermath, its effects on the people who survived it. They see Arthur trying to understand what happened, see John carrying the scars of his wounds, see Dutch slowly losing his mind. This focus on the human cost of violence is more powerful than any action sequence could be. It makes the massacre feel real, makes it matter, makes it hurt. The decision to start the game after Blackwater also creates a sense of inevitability that permeates the entire narrative. From the opening moments in Coulter, players know that the gang is doomed, that they are watching the slow-motion collapse of a family that has already been broken. This knowledge creates a melancholic tone that colours every moment of the game. Every act of kindness, every moment of camaraderie, every expression of loyalty is tinged with sadness, because we know it will not last, know that these people are doomed. know that their story can only end in death and destruction. This inevitability makes the game's emotional moments more powerful. When Arthur helps a stranger, when John plays with his son, when the gang sits around the campfire singing songs, these moments are precious because we know they are fleeting. The game is not about whether the gang will survive. It is about how they will fall apart, about what they will do with the time they have left, about whether they can find meaning and redemption in the face of inevitable destruction. Blackwater is the event that sets this tragedy in motion, the moment when the gang's fate is sealed. Everything that happens afterward is consequence, is falling action, is the slow unravelling of bonds that were already broken. The game does not need to show Blackwater because the entire game is about Blackwater, about its aftermath, about the ways it destroyed the people who survived it. Every conversation, every mission, every death is shaped by what happened on that ferry in May 1899. The massacre also serves as a meditation on memory and how it shapes identity. The gang members who were at Blackwater are defined by that experience, by what they saw and what they did. They cannot escape it, cannot forget it, cannot move past it. The memory of Blackwater haunts them, influences their decisions, shapes their relationships. For Dutch, the memory of killing Heidi McCourt is something he tries to suppress, to deny, to rationalise away. For John, the memory of being shot and nearly dying is a reminder of his mortality, of how close he came to leaving his family behind. For Bill and Javier, the memory of the chaos and violence reinforces their loyalty to Dutch, their need to believe that following him is the right choice. Memory is not just personal, but collective. The gang's shared memory of Blackwater, or rather their shared trauma from it, is part of what binds them together and part of what tears them apart. Those who were there share a bond that those who were not there cannot fully understand. But that bond is based on trauma, on shared suffering, on a terrible experience that none of them can fully process or articulate. This creates a paradox. The memory of Blackwater brings them together and drives them apart, creates intimacy and isolation, strengthens bonds and weakens them. The game explores how memory can be both a burden and a source of meaning. The gang members cannot forget Blackwater, but remembering it is painful. Yet that memory is also what gives their subsequent actions meaning. Arthur's determination to save people before he dies is motivated partly by his guilt over not being at Blackwater, over not preventing the disaster. John's decision to leave the gang is motivated partly by his memory of nearly dying at Blackwater, of seeing Dutch kill an innocent woman. The memory of Blackwater shapes who these characters become, influences their choices, or determines their fates. The Blackwater Massacre is also a story about the power of narrative, about how the stories we tell ourselves shape our understanding of reality. Dutch tells himself a story about Blackwater, that it was a betrayal, that the Pinkertons were waiting for them, that he had no choice but to kill Heidi McCourt. This story allows him to avoid taking responsibility for his actions, to maintain his self-image as a righteous outlaw fighting against an unjust system. But this story is a lie, and maintaining it requires Dutch to ignore evidence, to dismiss criticism, to surround himself with people like Micah, who will reinforce his delusions. Arthur and Hosea tell themselves a different story about Blackwater, that Dutch has changed, that the man they followed is gone, that something broke in him during the massacre, Well, this story allows them to maintain their loyalty to the memory of who Dutch was while acknowledging that he is no longer that person. But this story is also partly a lie, or at least an oversimplification. Dutch has not changed. He has simply stopped hiding who he always was. The violence and selfishness that emerged at Blackwater were always part of him, kept in check by Arthur and Hosea's influence, but never truly absent. The game suggests that all narratives are partial, that all stories are shaped by the perspectives and needs of those who tell them. There is no single, objective truth about Blackwater. There are only different versions, different interpretations, different ways of making sense of a chaotic and traumatic event. This multiplicity of narratives is not a weakness, but a strength. It makes the story more complex, is more realistic, more true to how people actually experience and remember traumatic events. The Blackwater Massacre is ultimately a story about loss, the loss of innocence, the loss of faith, the loss of family, the loss of a way of life. The gang loses 3 members at Blackwater, but they lose much more than that. They lose their confidence, their unity, their sense of purpose. They lose their belief in Dutch, their faith in the future, their hope that things will get better. They lose the illusion that they are the heroes of their own story, that they are fighting for something noble and just. Blackwater strips away these illusions and reveals the harsh reality underneath, that they are criminals running from the law, that their way of life is dying, that they are doomed. But the game also suggests that loss can be transformative, like that it can lead to growth and change. Arthur's loss of faith in Dutch leads him to become a better person, to help others, to seek redemption for his sins. John's loss of his outlaw family leads him to build a new family, to try to be a better father and husband. Charles's loss of the gang leads him to find peace and purpose elsewhere. Loss is painful, but it is also necessary. It is only by losing the illusions that sustain them that these characters can begin to see the truth, to make better choices, to become who they need to be. The Blackwater Massacre is the loss that makes all other losses possible, the wound that allows healing to begin. It is the moment when the gang's illusions are shattered, when they are forced to confront the reality of who they are and what they have become. This confrontation is painful, but it is also necessary. Without Blackwater, the gang would have continued on their path, would have kept robbing and killing, would have destroyed more lives. Blackwater forces a reckoning, creates a crisis that cannot be ignored, sets in motion the events that will ultimately lead to the gang's destruction, but also to the survival of some of its members. In this sense, Blackwater is both a tragedy and a necessary evil. It destroys the gang, but it also saves some of the people in it. It ends Dutch's dream, but it also frees people from that dream's destructive influence. It causes immense suffering, but it also creates the conditions for redemption and growth. The massacre is not good. It is a terrible, violent event that should never have happened. But its consequences are not entirely negative. Some good comes from the tragedy, and some people are saved, some lessons are learned. This moral complexity is what makes Red Dead Redemption 2 such a powerful and memorable game. It refuses to offer simple answers or easy moral judgments. It presents a world where good and evil are intertwined, where terrible events can have positive consequences, where the line between hero and villain is blurred. The Blackwater Massacre embodies this complexity. It is a crime and a tragedy, a betrayal and a revelation, an ending and a beginning. It is the event that destroys the Linde gang, and the event that allows some of its members to escape and build new lives. The town of Blackwater itself, when you finally gain access to it in the epilogue playing as John Marston, feels different from other locations in the game. It is more modern, more civilized, more orderly, as it represents everything the gang was running from, everything Dutch claimed to hate. The irony is that this is the place Dutch chose to rob, the place where he destroyed his gang in pursuit of money that was supposed to buy them freedom. Exploring Blackwater as John is a melancholy experience. You walk the streets where the massacre happened, see the ferry dock where Dutch killed Heidi McCourt, visit the places where gang members fought and died. The town has moved on. The people who live there have forgotten or never knew about the massacre. Life continues, indifferent to the tragedy that occurred there. This indifference is perhaps the cruelest aspect of Blackwater's legacy. All that death, all that suffering, all that loss, and the world barely noticed. The gang destroyed themselves for nothing, died for a score that did not matter, and sacrificed everything for money that could not save them. The massacre that defined their lives and determined their fates was just another day for the people of Blackwater, just another violent incident in a violent time barely worth remembering. The Blackwater Massacre is also connected to one of the game's strangest mysteries, the disappearance of the Blackwater athletics team. This is a separate incident from the massacre, but it's mentioned in newspapers and adds to the sense that Blackwater is a cursed place, a town where terrible things happen. The athletics team disappeared during a training run, and their bodies were later found arranged in a disturbing pattern. This mystery is never fully explained in the game, but it contributes to the atmosphere of dread and violence that surrounds Blackwater, suggesting that the town itself is somehow tainted, somehow marked by tragedy. The emotional weight of Blackwater is felt most strongly in the game's final chapters, when the gang is falling apart and everyone knows it. Characters reference Blackwater in conversations, using it as a marker of when things started to go wrong, when Dutch started to change, when the dream started to die. It all went bad after Blackwater, they say, as if naming the moment can somehow make sense of the chaos that followed. But naming the moment does not change anything. Blackwater happened, and nothing can undo it. Arthur's final conversation with Dutch, on the mountain where Arthur dies, is haunted by Blackwater. Arthur tells Dutch that he gave him everything, that he tried his best, but that Dutch's choices made it impossible to save him. And Arthur does not explicitly mention Blackwater, but it is there in the subtext, in the history between them, in all the decisions that led to this moment. Blackwater was the first step on the path that ends with Arthur dying on a mountain, and Dutch walking away, unable or unwilling to acknowledge what he has done. The relationship between Blackwater and the broader themes of Red Dead Redemption 2 is complex and multifaceted. The massacre is not just a plot device, but a lens through which the game explores questions of morality, loyalty, violence, and the death of the American frontier. Blackwater represents the moment when the Old West's last outlaws learned that they could not outrun civilization, couldn't escape the consequences of their actions, could not survive in a world that no longer had a place for them. The game uses Blackwater to explore the nature of leadership and the dangers of charismatic authority. Dutch van der Linde is a charismatic leader who inspires loyalty and devotion, but that charisma masks a fundamental selfishness and a capacity for violence. Blackwater is the moment when Dutch's true nature is revealed, when the mask slips, and the gang members see him for what he really is. But by then, they are too invested, too loyal, too afraid to leave. The game suggests that charismatic leadership is dangerous precisely because it creates this kind of blind loyalty, this willingness to follow even when following leads to destruction. The theme of the dying West is central to both Red Dead Redemption games, and Blackwater embodies this theme perfectly. The massacre represents the collision between the old ways and the new, between outlaws who thought they could live by their own rules and a modern society that would not tolerate their existence. The Pinkertons, with their organisation and resources and technology, represent the future. The Linde gang, with their horses and guns and outdated tactics, represent the past. Blackwater is the moment when the future defeats the past, when the Old West dies and the modern age begins. This theme is reinforced by the game's setting in 1899, the last year of the 19th century. The gang is living in the twilight of an era, clinging to a way of life that is already obsolete. Dutch talks about escaping to Tahiti or Australia, about finding a place where they can live free. But there is no such place. The modern world has arrived everywhere, bringing law and order and civilization. The outlaws who refuse to adapt are hunted down and killed. The age of the gunslinger is over, and Blackwater is the massacre that proves it. The game also uses Blackwater to explore the concept of the American dream and its dark underbelly. Dutch's vision for the gang is a twisted version of the American dream, the idea that through hard work and determination, anyone can achieve freedom and prosperity. But Dutch's version of this dream is built on violence and theft, on taking from others rather than building something of your own. Blackwater exposes the hollowness of Dutch's dream, reveals it as a lie that he tells himself and others to justify his actions. The gang is not fighting for freedom. They are running from consequences. They are not building a better life. They are destroying the lives they have. When the story finally ends, when John Marston lies dead in front of his barn and Jack Marston picks up his father's gun, we understand that Blackwater's legacy is still unfolding, that the cycle of violence it initiated has not yet ended. The massacre that happened in May 1899 continues to shape lives and determine fates more than a decade later. It is the ghost that haunts the entire Red Dead Redemption series, the original sin that cannot be forgiven or forgotten, the wound that never heals. And it is the reason why, despite all their efforts to escape their past, the members of the Linde gang can never truly be free. Blackwater follows them wherever they go, whatever they do, until the day they die. It is their curse, their burden, their inescapable fate. And it all started on a ferry, with a robbery that went wrong, and nothing was ever the same again. The psychological architecture of the Blackwater Massacre reveals itself not in what the game shows, but in what it withholds. By refusing to dramatize the violence, by keeping the massacre in the realm of memory and testimony, Red Dead Redemption 2 forces players to confront trauma the way trauma actually works, not as a coherent narrative with a beginning, middle and end, but as fragments, as intrusive thoughts, as things that cannot be fully articulated or understood. The gang members who were at Blackwater cannot tell you exactly what happened, because trauma does not work that way. They remember moments, the sound of gunfire, the smell of blood, the look on Dutch's face when he pulled the trigger. But these moments do not form a complete picture. They are shards of a broken mirror, that each reflecting a different angle of the same terrible event. This fragmentation is mirrored in the game's structure. Information about Blackwater comes to players in pieces, scattered across conversations, journal entries, environmental details. You learn about Heidi McCourt from Karen. You learn about the Pinkertons' presence from Arthur's questions. You learn about the money from Dutch's obsessive references to it. Each piece of information adds to your understanding, but the picture is never complete. There are always gaps, always questions that remain unanswered. This incompleteness is not a flaw in the storytelling, but its greatest strength. It makes Blackwater feel real, makes it feel like something that actually happened to these people rather than a plot point designed for player consumption. The game also uses Blackwater to explore the relationship between violence and identity. For the gang members who were there, Blackwater is not just something that happened to them, it is part of who they are. Bill Williamson cannot separate his identity from his participation in the massacre. He is a man who was at Blackwater, who saw terrible things, who did terrible things. This knowledge shapes how he sees himself and how others see him. The same is true for John, for Javier, for everyone who was there. Blackwater has marked them, has changed them in ways that cannot be undone. They carry it with them like a scar, visible to anyone who knows where to look. For Arthur and Hosea, who were not at Blackwater, the massacre represents a different kind of trauma. The trauma of absence, of not being there when you were needed, of failing to prevent something terrible. Arthur's guilt over not being at Blackwater is palpable in his journal entries and his conversations with other gang members. He feels responsible for what happened, even though he was not there, because he believes that if he had been there, he could have stopped it. This guilt drives much of Arthur's behaviour throughout the game, his determination to save people, his willingness to sacrifice himself for others. Arthur is trying to atone for Blackwater, trying to make up for his absence, trying to save people he could not save before. Hosea's response to Blackwater is more resigned, more fatalistic. Hosea has been with Dutch longer than anyone, and he has seen Dutch's dark side before. Blackwater does not surprise Hosea the way it surprises others. It confirms what Hosea has always suspected, that Dutch is capable of terrible things, that his philosophy is a mask for selfishness and violence, that the gang is built on a foundation of lies. Hosea tries to steer the gang towards safety, tries to convince Dutch to abandon the outlaw life, but he knows it is probably too late. Blackwater has set events in motion that cannot be stopped, and Hosea can only try to save as many people as possible before the inevitable end. The women of the gang, Susan Grimshaw, Tilly Jackson, Mary Beth Gaskill, Abigail Roberts, occupy a unique position in relation to Blackwater. They were not there, were not part of the robbery, but they live with its consequences every day. They see the men becoming more violent, more desperate, more broken. They see Dutch losing his mind. Rory see Arthur and Hosea trying to hold things together, see the gang falling apart. The women have no power to change what is happening, no say in the decisions that determine their fate. They are passengers on a ship that is sinking, and all they can do is hold on and hope they survive. Susan Grimshaw tries to maintain order and discipline in the camp, but Blackwater has made her job nearly impossible. Before the massacre, the gang had routines, rules, a sense of structure. After Blackwater, everything is chaos. They are constantly moving, constantly under threat, constantly one step away from disaster. Susan does her best to keep people focused, to maintain the illusion of normalcy, but she knows it is a losing battle. In her conversations with Arthur, Susan reveals her deep concern about Dutch's state of mind. Here her fear that he is losing control, her worry that the gang will not survive much longer. Tilly Jackson and Mary Beth Gaskill, the youngest women in the gang, represent a kind of innocence that Blackwater threatens to destroy. They join the gang looking for family, for belonging, for a place where they could be safe. But Blackwater has turned the gang into something dangerous, something that might destroy them rather than protect them. Throughout the game, Tilly and Mary Beth talk about leaving, about finding a different life, about escaping before it is too late. They are among the few gang members who successfully get out, who manage to build new lives away from the violence and the killing. Their survival is a small victory in a story full of tragedies. Abigail Roberts, John's wife and Jack's mother, he sees Blackwater as the moment when her worst fears were confirmed. Abigail has always known that the outlaw life is dangerous, that John could be killed at any moment, that their son could grow up without a father. Blackwater makes these fears real, makes them immediate. John was shot, nearly died, came back, changed. Abigail spends the rest of the game trying to convince John to leave, to choose his family over the gang, to save himself and his son before it is too late. Her desperation is palpable, her fear for her family's safety driving her to confront Dutch, to argue with John, to do whatever it takes to protect the people she loves. Reverend Swanson, the gang's alcoholic preacher, sees Blackwater through a religious lens. For Swanson, the massacre is divine punishment, God's judgment on the gang for their sins. In his more lucid moments, Swanson talks about how the gang has strayed from any moral path, how they have become the very thing they claim to fight against. Blackwater, in Swanson's view, was the moment when God stopped protecting them, when their luck ran out, when the consequences of their actions finally caught up with them. Swanson's religious interpretation of Blackwater is dismissed by most of the gang, but there is a truth in what he says. Blackwater was a reckoning, a moment when the gang's sins came due. Uncle, the lazy drunk who contributes almost nothing to the gang's operations, has his own theory about Blackwater. He believes the job was cursed from the start, that Dutch should have listened to his gut and called it off. Uncle claims he had a bad feeling about the Blackwater job, that he tried to warn people, but no one listened. Whether this is true or just Uncle rewriting history to make himself look smarter is unclear, but his superstitious interpretation of Blackwater reflects a common human need to find meaning in tragedy, to believe that disasters can be predicted or prevented if only people pay attention to the signs. The theme of loyalty and betrayal runs throughout the Blackwater narrative, creating a complex web of relationships and motivations. The gang members who were at Blackwater followed Dutch because they trusted him, because they believed in him, because they had faith that he would lead them to something better. That trust was betrayed when Dutch made a reckless decision that got people killed, when he murdered an innocent woman, when he prioritized his own escape over the safety of his people. But the gang members cannot simply walk away. They are bound to Dutch by years of shared history, by love and loyalty, by the knowledge that leaving the gang means being alone in a world that wants them dead. This is the tragedy of the Van der Linde gang. They know Dutch is leading them to destruction, but they cannot bring themselves to leave. Loyalty, which should be a virtue, becomes a trap. Love, which should be a source of strength, becomes a weakness. The bonds that hold the gang together are the same bonds that prevent them from saving themselves. Blackwater created this situation by forcing the gang into a desperate flight, where leaving meant certain death. by the time it becomes clear that staying also means death, it is too late to escape. The game explores how institutions and systems respond to events like Blackwater. The Pinkertons, representing the forces of law and order, use the massacre as justification for their increasingly brutal tactics. They torture suspects, they manipulate witnesses, they use any means necessary to destroy the gang. The massacre gives them moral cover for actions that would otherwise be questioned, allows them to present themselves as heroes fighting against dangerous criminals. But the game shows that the Pinkertons are often as brutal and ruthless as the outlaws they hunt, that their methods are sometimes indistinguishable from the crimes they claim to be preventing. The newspapers in the game provide another perspective on Blackwater, showing how the media shapes public perception of events. The massacre is reported as a clear-cut case of outlaws attacking innocent people and being driven off by brave lawmen. There is no mention of the Pinkertons' role, no acknowledgement of the complexity of what happened, no recognition that the truth might be more complicated than the official narrative suggests. The newspapers present a sanitized version of Blackwater, one that fits neatly into the story of civilization triumphing over lawlessness, of progress defeating barbarism. This gap between the official narrative and the lived experience of the gang members is significant. It shows how history is written by the victors, how the truth is often lost in the process of turning events into stories. The gang members know what really happened at Blackwater, but their version of events will never be recorded, will never be believed, will never be part of the official history. They are the losers, the criminals, the people whose perspective does not matter. Their truth dies with them, leaving only the official version, the sanitized story that serves the interests of those in power. The game also explores how communities are affected by violence. Blackwater is a real town with real people, and the massacre has consequences for them as well. The town becomes more heavily policed, more suspicious of strangers, more fearful of the violence that the frontier represents. The people of Blackwater want to believe that they are safe, that civilization has arrived, that the days of outlaws and gunfights are over. But the massacre reminds them that violence is always close, that the frontier is not as tamed as they would like to believe, that the old ways are still present beneath the veneer of modernity. The economic impact of Blackwater is also significant. The ferry was carrying a fortune in bank money, and its loss affects the financial system of the region. Banks become more cautious, more protective of their assets, more willing to hire private security like the Pinkertons. The massacre accelerates the professionalization of law enforcement, the development of systems and technologies designed to prevent similar incidents. In this way, Blackwater contributes to the very modernization that the gang is trying to escape, helps create the world that will eventually destroy them. The game uses Blackwater to explore questions about the nature of evil and moral responsibility. Is Dutch evil, or is he simply a man who made terrible choices under pressure? Are the gang members who followed him complicit in his crimes, or are they victims of his manipulation? Is Micah evil, or is he just a survivor doing what he needs to do to stay alive? These questions do not have easy answers, and the game does not pretend to provide them. Instead, it presents complex situations and allows players to grapple with these questions themselves. The massacre also raises questions about collective guilt and individual responsibility. The gang members who were at Blackwater all participated in the robbery, all contributed to the violence that occurred, but they did not all play the same role, did not all make the same choices, did not all bear the same responsibility. Dutch killed Heidi McCourt, but the others did not. They witnessed it. They were complicit in the robbery that created the situation, but they did not pull the trigger. How much responsibility do they bear for Dutch's actions? How much guilt should they carry? The game does not provide clear answers, but it forces players to think about these questions, to consider the complexity of moral responsibility in situations where many people are involved and the lines of causation are unclear. The relationship between Blackwater and the game's exploration of masculinity is also significant. The gang is predominantly male, and the outlaw life is presented as a particularly masculine form of existence. Violent, competitive, focused on strength and dominance. Blackwater exposes the toxicity of this masculinity, shows how it leads to violence and destruction, how it prevents men from expressing vulnerability or admitting mistakes. Dutch cannot admit that he was wrong about Blackwater because doing so would be seen as weakness, as a failure of masculine authority. Bill and Javier cannot question Dutch because doing so would challenge the masculine hierarchy that structures the gang. This toxic masculinity is part of what destroys the gang, part of what prevents them from making the changes necessary for survival. Arthur Morgan's arc is partly about rejecting this toxic masculinity, about learning to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, to prioritize care and compassion over strength and dominance. Arthur's illness forces him to confront his mortality, to recognize that strength and violence cannot save him, that what matters in the end is how you treat people, what you do with the time you have. This transformation is made possible partly by Blackwater, by the crisis it creates, by the way it forces Arthur to question everything he has believed about Dutch and the gang and himself. The game also explores how trauma affects different people in different ways, how there is no single response to terrible events. Some people, like Bill, become more violent and more rigid in their beliefs. Others, like John, become more questioning and more willing to change. Some, like Karen, turn to self-destruction. Others, like Charles, find ways to process their trauma and move forward. The game does not suggest that any of these responses is right or wrong, better or worse. It simply shows that people respond to trauma in different ways, that there is no single path through suffering. The role of storytelling in processing trauma is also explored through the game. The gang members tell stories about Blackwater, trying to make sense of what happened, trying to create a narrative that explains the chaos and violence. These stories are not always accurate, not always consistent, but they serve a purpose. They allow the gang members to process their experiences, to share their pain, to create meaning from meaninglessness. The act of telling the story, of putting the experience into words, is itself a form of healing, even if the story is incomplete or contradictory. The game suggests that some experiences are too traumatic to be fully processed, too overwhelming to be integrated into a coherent narrative. Blackwater is one of these experiences. The gang members who were there cannot fully explain what happened, cannot make sense of it, cannot move past it. The massacre remains a wound that never heals, a trauma that continues to affect them until the day they die. And this is a realistic portrayal of how severe trauma works. It does not always get better with time, does not always resolve into a neat narrative, does not always lead to growth or healing. The cyclical nature of violence in the Red Dead Redemption series is embodied in the Blackwater Massacre. The massacre leads to years of running and killing, which leads to more massacres, which leads to John being forced to hunt down his former friends, which leads to John's death, which leads to Jack seeking revenge on Edgar Ross. Each act of violence creates the conditions for the next act of violence, creating a cycle that spans generations. This cycle is not unique to the van der Linde gang. It is the story of America itself, a nation built on violence, where conflicts are resolved with guns, where justice is often indistinguishable from revenge. The game suggests that this cycle can only be broken by choosing not to participate in it, by walking away from violence even when violence seems justified. But the game also shows how difficult this choice is, how the circumstances of life can make violence seem like the only option, how the desire for revenge or justice or survival can override moral considerations. The characters who survive, Charles, Sadie, Tilly, Mary Beth, are the ones who manage to walk away, who choose a different path, who refuse to let the cycle consume them. But even they carry the scars of what they experienced, the memories of what they lost, the knowledge of what they were part of. The Blackwater Massacre is ultimately a story about the death of the American frontier, about the end of an era when outlaws could still carve out a life on the edges of civilization. It is a story about people who refused to accept that their time was over, who kept fighting even when fighting was futile, who died for a dream that was always a lie. It is a story about loyalty and betrayal, about violence and its consequences, about the cost of ambition and the price of freedom. It is a story that resonates because it is fundamentally human, a story about people trying to survive in a world that is changing too fast, trying to hold on to a way of life that is disappearing, trying to believe in a leader who does not deserve their faith. The massacre is the original sin that damns everyone involved, the wound that never heals, the ghost that haunts the game from beginning to end. It is the moment when Dutch's mask slips. We zien them. When the gang's unity shatters, when the Old West's last outlaws learn that they cannot outrun civilization, cannot escape the consequences of their actions, cannot survive in a world that no longer has a place for them. Everything that happens in Red Dead Redemption 2, every death, every betrayal, every moment of suffering can be traced back to that ferry in Blackwater, to Dutch's ambition, to Micah's treachery, to the gang's fatal decision to trust the wrong person and take the wrong job. And when the story finally concludes, when the last gang member has died or disappeared, when the Old West has finally been tamed, we understand that it all started in Blackwater, with a robbery that went wrong and a woman who died for no reason, and nothing was ever the same again.